In July 1955, Panama Flight 914 left New York City Airport en route to Miami. The plane and its 57 passengers seemingly vanished into thin air. On a hot July morning in 1955, a plane took off from New York with 57 people on board. It was headed for Miami, but it never landed. For 37 years, the flight was a total mystery until it suddenly showed up on a radar screen in Venezuela in 1992. The plane that landed wasn't a new jet, but an old propeller plane from the past. It returned with a secret that seems impossible for our world to explain. The impossible arrival. The arrival of the silver aircraft in Caracas is the moment where the world of the ordinary collided with the world of the impossible in a way that left everyone involved changed forever. To understand the weight of this event, you have to imagine the scene at the Simón Boulevard International Airport on that strange morning in 1992. The sun was high and the humidity was thick, making the air feel heavy as ground crews moved about their usual business of refueling modern jets and loading luggage onto massive carriers. In the control tower, the atmosphere was routine until a faint, scratchy sound began to crackle over the radio frequencies. It was not the crisp digital audio of a modern cockpit, but a sound full of static and age, like a recording from a forgotten basement. When the radar technicians looked at their screens, they saw a blip that had appeared out of nowhere, not coming from any known flight path or approaching from the usual commercial corridors. This was a ghost in the machine, a signal that defied the logic of the highly regulated airspace. As the plane emerged from the hazy clouds, the people on the ground stopped what they were doing to stare at a sight that made no sense. It was a Douglas DC-4, a massive propeller plane with 4 engines that looked like a shiny silver time capsule. This kind of plane had been the king of the skies in the years following World War II, but by 1992 it was a relic that belonged in a museum or a scrapyard. Yet there it was, descending toward the runway with its landing gear down and its engines humming a deep, rhythmic song that modern jet engines simply cannot replicate. The metal skin of the aircraft was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the Venezuelan sun so brightly that it almost blinded the workers on the tarmac. There were no signs of rust, no faded paint, and no marks of the decades that should have passed since its construction. It looked as if it had been maintained by a crew that lived in a world where time had stopped moving forward. In the tower, the confusion turned into a kind of quiet panic. Juan de la Corte, the lead controller, tried to establish a clear line of communication, his voice steady, but his mind racing to find an explanation. When the pilot finally spoke, his words were polite and professional, yet they carried an undertone of deep, unsettling confusion. The pilot identified himself as being in command of a flight from New York to Miami, a route that was thousands of miles away from where he currently hovered. He spoke of his passengers as if they were just minutes away from their destination, complaining about the heat and asking for a gate number. The tension in the tower grew thicker when the pilot was asked for his flight plan and his date of departure. When he replied that he had left New York on July 2, 1955, the room went completely cold. The controllers looked at each other with expressions of pure disbelief, wondering if they were the victims of a very elaborate and expensive prank, or if they were witnessing a miracle. The most interesting part of this encounter was the visual connection between the two different worlds. As the plane taxied closer to the terminal, the ground crew could see the passengers through the small, rounded windows of the DC-4. These were not ghosts or monsters, they were people dressed in the fashion of the mid-50s, with men in narrow ties and fedoras, and women with carefully styled hair and white gloves. They looked out at the airport with a mixture of curiosity and growing terror.
They saw giant Boeing 747s and strange futuristic ground vehicles that looked like something out of a science fiction movie. To the people on the plane, the world had changed into a foreign planet in the span of a single morning. The physical proximity of these two eras, the 50s metal sitting on 90s asphalt, created a psychological friction that is still studied by mystery hunters today. It was a moment where the linear flow of history was broken, leaving a group of travelers stranded in a future they were never meant to see. The situation reached a breaking point when the pilot realized that the voices in his ears were telling him the year was 1992. He began to shout, his professional tone dissolving into a high-pitched, frantic energy. He warned the ground crew to stay away as they approached with steps and fuel lines, waving them off as if they were invaders. He seemed to realize that if he stayed on the ground for too long, he might become trapped in this strange new world forever. The sound of the engines changed from a low idle to a desperate roar as he prepared to flee. In that final chaotic moment, as the pilot gestured wildly out of his side window, a small object fell from the cockpit and landed softly on the runway. It was a tiny pocket calendar, a simple piece of paper that would later become the most debated piece of evidence in the history of the unexplained. Without waiting for a clear path or permission from the tower, the pilot turned the silver beast around and accelerated. The plane lifted off, banking hard away from the airport and disappearing into the clouds as quickly as it had arrived. The aftermath of the arrival left the airport in a state of stunned silence. The radar screens, which had just been tracking the mysterious craft, went blank once again. There was no trail to follow, no signal to track, and no radio response to the frantic calls from the tower. All that remained was the smell of old aviation fuel in the air and the small 1955 calendar sitting on the ground. This section of the story is the most powerful because it presents us with a physical mystery that cannot be easily dismissed by logic. It forces us to imagine the terror of the pilot and the shock of the controllers, two groups of people separated by time but connected by a few minutes of radio static. It is the core of the legend because it offers a glimpse into a world where the rules we live by, that time only moves forward and that the past is gone, are suddenly and violently proven wrong. While the arrival in Caracas serves as the heart of the mystery, we must travel back to the day the clock first stopped to understand the scale of the disappearance. The flight of 1955. To truly appreciate the shock of the plane's return, we have to immerse ourselves in the world of 1955, an era that felt permanent and stable to those living through it. Panama Flight 914 was not just a number on a board, it was a symbol of the booming post-war American dream. On that July morning at Idlewild Airport, the air was filled with coffee and tobacco and the sounds of bustling families heading toward the promise of a Florida summer. The 57 passengers who climbed the metal stairs into the Douglas DC-4 represented a cross-section of mid-century life. On July 2, 1955, a Douglas DC-4 airplane with 57 passengers and 6 crew members took off from New York City bound for Miami, Florida. There were businessmen in heavy wool suits carrying leather briefcases, mothers holding the hands of children dressed in their Sunday best, and couples looking forward to the vibrant nightlife of Miami. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was of quiet excitement. The seats were wide and upholstered in thick fabric, and the windows offered a clear view of the 4 massive piston engines that would power their journey. For these people, the flight was a luxury, a fast way to bridge the 1,000 miles between the skyline of New York and the palm trees of the South. The Douglas DC-4 was a masterpiece of engineering for its time, a 4-engine giant that had helped win a world war before transitioning to civilian service. It was a rugged, reliable machine that pilots trusted with their lives. On this particular day, the crew was led by a captain with years of experience, a man who had flown through storms and fog without ever losing his cool. As the engines began to turn, a rhythmic thumping vibrated through the floor of the cabin, a sound that gave the passengers a sense of power and safety. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway, passing by other silver aircraft that looked nearly identical. When the control tower gave the final clearance, the pilot pushed the throttles forward. The roar of the 1,450 horsepower engines filled the cabin, and the plane began its long roll down the asphalt. As the nose lifted off and the ground fell away, the passengers looked down at the expanding grid of New York City, unaware that they were leaving their own timeline behind. The first few hours of the flight were perfectly routine, the kind of boring success that every airline